So life is a collision of stories. What do I mean by that? So if I'm reading Deuteronomy, which I was doing a lot this week because I had to catch up from the week before in Bible reading. If I'm reading Deuteronomy, these stories that I'm reading, they collide in my imagination when I open up Jude, when I'm reading Jude this week, and when I'm reading Mark. When I meet someone and I hear their life story for the first time, or maybe for the 1,000th time, the story of their life, the telling of that story collides with my life story in unique and always interesting ways. When you read a good biography, the lives of the dead collide with our present life. When you read fiction, the imagined lives of countless characters, they begin to intertwine with your own. And if you've read stories over and over again, they hit you at different places, at different seasons in your life. Life is a collision of stories. Every time this kind of collision occurs, we make choices. We're invited to participate. I want to be like that character. I will never be like him. I wasn't pointing at you, Josiah. I'll never be like him. They went through so much heartache and pain. I want to grieve like that, and things like this over and over again. Every time we open our Bible, every time we read a new book or watch a new movie even, every time we meet someone and share a meal with them and we ask good questions, we want them to open up and tell their stories, we're changed. And this is stories colliding. They always change us. So the story of our gospel reading is the only miracle aside from the resurrection. Now, let me just say that's a miracle. The resurrection from the dead is a miracle. But this story in our gospel reading is the only miracle recounted in all four gospels. This story about Jesus feeding the 5,000 collides in each gospel story, with each gospel writer in unique ways. Every telling of this story or retelling highlights different and complementary and significant details. And this shouldn't be a surprise. Every time we tell a story, it comes alive in new and fresh ways because stories collide. I've told the story of my life, or even at the end of the day when I come home and I still tell the story of a day, and if I tell it to multiple people, every time it's unique. Not because I'm telling an entirely new story, but because my story is colliding with a person, with another person who's interpreting and having a conversation, and their own story comes into it, and this collision always brings out new connections and new correspondences and new and hopefully deeper shared affections. And these collisions don't just happen in one-on-one conversations. If you put a family around a dinner table and one person tells a story, there's a lot of collisions happen, and you know that conversation can go in any direction. It depends on who speaks up. You put a group of friends around a fire, and the collisions multiply. In the telling and the hearing and the responding, we become more together, and we're always being changed. We're becoming different. We're changed. So each gospel writer tells this story about the feeding of the 5,000, about Jesus in a unique and beautiful way. And so let's zoom in a little bit to Mark's gospel account, and we'll see some colliding stories. So I'm just looking at Mark from 10,000 feet. All right, zoomed out a little bit. The first 5 chapters, which we've been in for a few months now in Mark's gospel, the first 5 chapters are the disciples with Jesus. And then we saw last week in Mark chapter 6, Jesus sends the disciples out from him, right? So there's a collision here. There's a turning point. The first 5 chapters of Mark recount many confrontations with demons and with spiritual authorities, and this continues throughout Mark's gospel. But in Mark 6, there's another shift. The shift of the confrontations shifts from not spiritual powers, but to earthly powers, earthly authorities, kings and religious rulers. In the first 5 chapters of Mark, bread is mentioned only once, and that's when Jesus is teaching about David going in and eating the bread of the presence. But in Mark chapters 6 through 8, bread is mentioned at least 17 times on my count. So let's zoom in a little bit closer. Zoom in a little bit closer to Mark chapter 6. So recall from last Sunday, Mark 6 is one of many sandwiches in Mark's gospel. What do I mean by the sandwich? I'm mixing sandwich and bread metaphors here, so I know that can be maybe confusing. We'll see. All right, so last week we saw one side of the sandwich. We saw this piece of bread, or a bookend, if that's better for your imagination, a bookend, and there's meat in the middle of that. That's another story that's inserted into the middle. And so this week we're turning towards the second piece of bread. Okay, we're finishing the sandwich this week. So looking back again from last week in verse 7 of Mark chapter 6, remember Jesus, he sent out the 12 as ambassadors of the king with the authority of the king to speak and to act like the king, to speak and act like the king. And this sending out of the 12, it pointed forward. It pointed forward to the meat of the story, which comes after, which is King Herod's response to this proclamation. His response was, in the end, we saw that it was hostility to the message. John proclaimed the gospel of repentance just like the disciples did, and King Herod cut off his head. So the story of Jesus sending out the 12 to proclaim the gospel collided on one side with this story, and now we're turning to the other side of the story. Look with me at verse 30 of Mark chapter 6. The apostles, they just went out, and now on the other side of this central story, the apostles returned. They're coming back to Jesus, and they told him all that they had done and taught. So this is the other side of the sandwich. The 12 were sent out, then the story of Herod and John, and now the 12 are returning to Jesus. And like our story last week, which pointed forward, our story this week is pointing back. It's pointing back with this story of the miraculous feeding of 5,000. So this is the first of many bread stories in the next 3 chapters, which we're going to rehearse and we're going to see in coming weeks and months. And this story collides with King Herod. So we're going to look back. We're going to look back at the Herod story to help understand the feeding of the 5,000. Look with me at verse 31, continuing in our story. Mark chapter 6 and verse 31. And Jesus said to the 12, he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. They went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves." So this is the setting. This is the setting of our story this morning. The 12 apostles, they're exhausted. They're exhausted. They've been sent out ahead of Jesus, the king, 2 by 2 into homes and to towns, announcing that the king is coming. Turn around, pay attention, he's coming. And in some places where they went, they were rejected, the same hostile response that John the Baptist had and that Jesus had before them. But, as we saw last week, in some places, they received hospitality. They stayed there for a while. And so the word began to spread in towns and in homes throughout the countryside. People were excited and eager to be with this Jesus that they were hearing about. The emissaries went out and they wanted to be with him. So in either case, whether it was hostility, whether they were met with hostility or hospitality, they were all exhausted from this. They were exhausted. They've been going and going. And just like Jesus, they needed some time alone. Or as we say in our house, we just need some alone time. We need some alone time. Time to rest, time to be restored, to be close to Jesus again. We're coming back. We're coming back. So it is in this place, this is the setting, that they've returned to Jesus and he tells them to get away by themselves and rest. It is in this place where 3 collisions occur in our story. 3 collisions. The first collision is a collision with the crowds. We have seen Jesus over and over again in Mark, over and over again, collide with the crowds many times. They meet him in the house. He goes away to the sea. They meet him there. He comes back to the house. They're following him everywhere. And now the disciples are getting their first taste of this collision. Look with me at verse 33. Now, many saw them going and recognized them. They saw the disciples with Jesus going and they recognized them. And, this is so funny, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So the disciples have just returned 2 by 2 from their exhausting journeys. They're exhausted, they're tired. They have been received and they've been rejected. They're hungry, the text says. They didn't have time to eat. From home to home and town to town, carrying nothing with them but the gospel. And excitement was stirring in all the villages and in and around Capernaum. So they come back to Jesus, and Jesus recognizes that they're so tired. So they get in a boat, they push off. And we've seen this before in Mark's gospel. They push off to get away and rest, but many saw them. So you can imagine them leaving houses and towns and just sort of like following them back. Maybe we'll find this Jesus that they were talking about, right? So they're following him back. They saw him, and they saw the direction by which they went out in this boat, and they start sprinting on the shores to predict where they're going to land. It's hilarious. And they get there ahead of them. Have you been there before? Have you been in this place, in that place of exhaustion, of pouring yourself out physically and emotionally and spiritually? And then, just when you think you're going to get some rest, more exhaustion runs out in front of you and meets you right there. You've poured yourself out maybe in ministry or just ministering in your home and serving others. And just when you sit down on the couch, the phone rings and another crisis happens. Maybe you've stayed up all night with a sick child, and as soon as they recover, another child gets sick. There's a lot of different ways to tell this story. We've been there before. You've finally gone on vacation, and then you're sick the whole week. That's happened to everybody. One exhaustion after another. So this is Jesus' pattern in the gospel. Jesus pours himself out, and Jesus himself needed rest, and he needed to get away. Jesus knows your labors too. He sees you as you pour yourself out for others in secret. And then he says to you, Christian, come away with me to a desolate place and rest. But the children follow you into your office. Your anxiety goes with you on vacation. The crowds go out ahead of you. And we respond like the disciples, skipping ahead one verse to verse 35. And when it grew late, his disciples, I love the disciples' response, came to him and said, this is a desolate place and the hour is now late. Send them away. Please, just send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages. I need a break. That's what you said you were going to give us. We're tired and we're hungry. Lord, please send them away so we can be alone. But this is not how Jesus responds to the crowds. And it's remarkable. It's remarkable. Go back to verse 34. When Jesus went ashore, he saw this great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Jesus, he just never stops. He keeps pouring himself out. Before the story, before the feeding of the 5,000, this is all building up to this story. Here's the encouragement for weary disciples. When we inevitably collide with the crowd, when you've spent all your money and then another bill rolls in, when you've given all your food away to feed others, when you're tired and hungry and you need to get away, in that place, Jesus is always going with you. He's there. He's present. He's with you. When the crowds follow you to the desolate place, When troubles multiply and never seem to give you a break, the compassion of Jesus breaks in for weary disciples. Before you and with you and around you, his compassionate words will guard you and keep you when all your plans, all of your well-laid plans for rest have fallen through. There will be, and here's the prophecy for this morning, there will be many seasons in your life when you will pour yourself out to a complete exhaustion and the break will never come. It will never seem to come. And Jesus goes with you into that place. His compassion and his patience, not only for the crowds, but for you, is inexhaustible. So the first collision before the story is the collision with the crowds, this inevitable collision with the crowds. And the second collision is a collision of kingdoms. It's a collision of kingdoms. So what usually collides when kingdoms go to war? What do kings send out onto the battlefield? They send armies. So let's look back on the story before our story a little bit. The story about King Herod. King is mentioned 5 times in this story. What kind of king is Herod? It's a surprising answer in Mark's gospel, one that I'd never really noticed before. Mark presents Herod as being a very reasonable king. Look at the text at verse 20. King Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. Herod kept John safe. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. King Herod heard John gladly. So King Herod is not presented as Hitler or Thanos or whatever big bad guy you can think of. He's not presented as an outright villain. He is what we might call the wise pagan philosopher king. He rather likes John. He knows John is righteous and holy, and he has a healthy respect for him. He heard what John said, and the text says gladly. He heard it gladly. He might not agree with John. He might be perplexed, but he wants to keep John safe. He wants to rule as a good king with charity, with hospitality for differing views in his kingdom, but like the kings of Israel, and if you go rehearse the story in 2 Samuel and in 1 Kings and at the beginning of 2 Kings in particular, he is foolish like Ahab and like many other kings with women, and this leads to murder and to ruin in his court. So this story before our gospel reading is about a gathering, right? So there's a birthday party for King Herod, and who gathers in the story? Verse 21. It's nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. So the story of his birthday party is a king gathering his army. It's a king gathering his army. He did not intend to go to war. He did not set out to go to war, but Herod's story ends with bloodshed. So why do I mention this? Well, King Herod's birthday party for his army in the city at the center of power is followed by another gathering in a desolate place. And in this story, 5,000 men are gathered together, formally organized in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And this is, in the scriptures, this is the language of warfare. It's preparing for battle. Like many times in human history, another king has set up camp outside of a city and gathered in a desolate place and gathered an army together outside the city. And using the language of 1 Kings chapter 22, when the Lord Yahweh's army was gathered against another king, and it says in 1 Kings 22, like sheep without a shepherd, King Jesus organizes his sheep for war. How does he do it? Look at verse 39. Then King Jesus commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. What's going on here? What's going on? There's a twist. And we're meant to recall in this detail, and this detail is only given in Mark's gospel. They sit down on green grass. Yahweh, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. So this warfare imagery is overlapped with this shepherding imagery in multiple texts. This is how the gospel wages war. This is gospel warfare. Swords are beaten into plowshares. The shepherd king, Jesus teaches, he conquers hearts, he does not cut off heads. The wolf king, Herod, gathers his army in the place of power, in the place of intellectual esteem and beautiful women and lavish birthday parties, and it leads finally to death. The wolf devours the sheep. The shepherd king, Jesus, gathers his army in a desolate place. He commands his tired and exhausted lieutenants to organize and to feed his army in the green grass. And it leads to life and to fullness and satisfaction. And all of this together leads finally to the last collision in our text. How does the shepherd king, Jesus, go to war against this world, against these principalities and powers, both in heaven and on earth? How does he do that? He does it with a feast. The final collision is a collision of feasts. The language of Jesus' desolate meal is surprisingly formal, and I'm not going to go through all the details of that. This is not an impromptu picnic out in a desolate place. This is described as a kingly feast, a heavenly banquet on earth, and the guests are seated in organized groups. The table is set, but unlike Herod's lavish banquet with all the powerful in the land, King Jesus' exhausted lieutenants only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This is not going to be a very good feast. The disciples tell Jesus, send them away, send them back to the cities where they can get something to eat. This is not just a I'm tired, but we literally can't feed these people. We might want to care for them, but we can't. We don't have enough. It would take a half year's wages to feed these people. So send them back to Herod. He's got plenty. Let him go to that party. And Jesus responds to his weary warriors. He says, sit down. Sit down, and then have everyone else sit down. Greater than the prophet Elisha, who has a very similar story. Go read it in 2 Kings chapter 4. Jesus multiplies bread and fish, and the more the heavenly bread is broken, the more there is to eat. Everyone ate until they were full and satisfied, and they could hardly even carry the leftovers. 4th century church father Ephraim the Syrian describes the scene well. That which people effect and transform in 10 months with toil, his 10 fingers effected in an instant. For he placed his hand beneath the bread as though it were earth, and spoke over it as though thunder. The murmur of his lips sprinkled over it like rain, and the breath of his mouth in place of the sun. Thus did he complete in the flash of one tiny moment something which requires a whole lengthy hour. One tiny amount of bread was forgotten, and from the midst of its smallness, abundance came to birth, so that it might be like the first blessing. What's the first blessing? Give birth and be fruitful and multiply. The loaves of bread, Ephraim says, the loaves of bread, like barren women and women deprived, became fruitful at his blessing, and many were the morsels born from them. I love that poetic imagery of Jesus doing what we do in 10 months, in sowing and feeding and watering and then harvesting and then making bread. He did it in an instant. Jesus took the bread in his hands and he declared war. And he did 4 actions, which he will repeat again later in this gospel. What are the 4 actions? In verse 41, Jesus took the bread, he blessed it, then he broke it, and then he gave it. He gave it to his disciples. On the night that he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus Christ took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." We say that every Sunday. This table is where the battle is won and where it's waged. Here and then in our homes, far outside the palace, far away from places of honor and kings of this world, our abundant God feeds us and restores us together at his lavish banqueting table in desolate places, in the places of exhaustion, of pouring yourself out over and over again, in the place of all the faithful unseen labor. And that, I think that's so important. To resist the temptation to take a picture of it, right? We don't need to post it on social media all the time. Do it in secret, and he sees you there. The great crowds, now organized and fed and satisfied, are then sent out into the world with more leftovers than they can carry and with the gospel on their lips. Herod's drunken and luxurious feast, like the feast of Babylon, leads to death and famine. What seems on the outside like a place of security and strength and wealth and plenty leads finally to ruin. Revelation chapter 18. In that place, the voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard no more. But in the next chapter, Revelation 19, in its place, the voice of a diverse and countless multitude, misfits and outcasts, repentant kings and repentant slaves, men and women, young and old, gathered together among the host of heaven at the great feast, the marriage supper of the Lamb, singing praises to God and to the Lamb. The banquet ended, plates still overflow. And with the crumbs, 12 baskets then they fill. The stuffed boy strives with undigested fare. The waiter groans beneath his heavy load. Who can a great feast spread from stores so few? Who but the maker of our frame and all? 12 men were charged to heap in baskets full the gifts of Christ to keep and spread afar. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.